cheers. Here's Siddle. Oh, that ball is close. He's given him. He's given him. Peter Siddle's got a hat-trick on his birthday.
Welcome back to the On the Ball podcast. This is episode 66 of the show. And today we are back to review the cycling, the final episode of the trilogy. So we've reviewed the action so far on the 2 rest days, and now we are finally at the race's end. So I thought it would only be fair to do a roundup episode of everything we've witnessed in the last 3 weeks. And we're just going to follow the normal structure of just team by team analysis, go through their performance in each jersey and stuff like that. But firstly, I just want to talk about the Tour overall. I really, really enjoyed this Tour de France. I'll be honest, I do enjoy most of them, as I do love it. But this one, I think since I've probably watched everyone since like 2008, this probably sticks out as one of my favourites. This is probably, yes, I guess if Roglic ended up winning, I probably wouldn't be saying this. So I guess you can argue it's just because of one time trial that I'm saying this, but I honestly think it's just one of the closest fought ones I've seen in a while. Kind of got sick of all the Team Sky, Ineos domination. We had Chris Froome, Wiggins, Thomas, and Bernal last year, all winning fairly comfortably. And then before that, there were some good additions. Cadel Evans. Then you had the famous Contador versus Schlecks. And those were some great races, but I really loved this one. And I just did not see this winner coming out. I'll be honest, before this race started, I'd heard of his name, but I didn't know the caliber of racer he was. And Tadej Pogacar stole all the headlines, really. It looked perfectly set up for Primož Roglic and Jumbo-Visma to win yellow. But Tadej Pogacar really stole the show. And the young Slovenian from UAE Team Emirates finished with the yellow jersey in Paris, which is the biggest honour in cycling. And he's only 21. So he's the second youngest ever rider to do it. And it's just insane what he did on that final time trial. It's probably the most intense stage I've ever witnessed. Myself, I prefer, the big mountain climbs like stage 17, where it's just the GC favourites attacking each other, seeing who's going to break. But usually time trials are very boring. But this one, you just expected Primož to come out and just smash Pogacar. And Pogacar just smashed everyone. Primož didn't even ride badly. He just looked bad in comparison to Pogacar, who absolutely killed it. But yeah, Pogacar, so impressive in pretty much every aspect of it. To think that he lost 1 minute and 20 seconds, I think it was, on something silly like an echelon on a crosswind day. I think he had a mechanical as well on that day, and he still made up that time. Just shows how well he rode in the last 2 weeks of the Tour. He was the best climber by a long way. Miguel Angel Lopez, I guess, was pretty good, especially on stage 17, but Pogacar was consistently the guy who was pushing the pace in the mountains, willing to attack. Where Roglic, obviously, he was very strong the whole Tour, but he never really attacked. He was always kind of just defending moves. But I guess that's what you have to do in the yellow jersey. But yeah, Pogacar definitely deserving of his victory. But yeah, we'll just go team by team analysis, and we'll just talk about, who I think is the rider of the tournament, the race, sorry, what I thought about each jersey as we roll through the teams. And yeah, so starting off, we've got the team winner. Not the winner of the team classification, but the winners team. So that sounds so dodgy, but UAE Team Emirates. They had a pretty good team on paper coming into it. They had David de la Cruz, Fabio Aru, Davide Formolo, Tadej Pogacar, 4 really great climbers. But their hopes kind of crumbled early. Aru was out stage 9, Formolo was out stage 10. De la Cruz looked out of form early, and Pogacar just nothing bothered him really. He put absolute clinics in. He ended up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 8 top 10, which is incredible in itself. Definitely deserving of the yellow jersey, as I was saying before. Just the fact that what did he make? Like a minute and a half on Roglic on that time trial was just outstanding riding. And he actually ended up winning the King of the Mountains and the white jersey. Obviously won the white jersey if he won the yellow, but to win the King of the Mountains also shows that he was the best climber in the Tour. But yeah, usually kind of strange that he won the King of the Mountains. Usually the top GC favourites are up there, but usually it's a breakaway specialist who wins it. I think this year though, less breakaways got away from the peloton. So I don't know if that was because Jumbo-Visma were very controlling at the front of the peloton or what that was, but that was a bit strange. But yeah, he came first. He was 8th in the green jersey as well, so he was pretty much there for everything. As a team, they ended up coming 9th, but there was not really anyone else of note. And then Christoph on the last day had a 4th. So overall, if I had to give them a rating, you couldn't really do anything other than a 10 out of 10. I don't think it was the greatest team performance, like it wasn't a Team Sky or a Jumbo-Visma kind of team domination, but Pogacar, rider of the tournament race, let's be real. And then Christoph spent a day in yellow and won a stage, so not much else Team UAE Emirates could have achieved in this 3-week block. Next up, we've got Jumbo-Visma. Obviously, the team who had the yellow jersey for like 10 days going into the final stage or something like that. They were the most dominant team of the whole 3 weeks. But unfortunately, they stumbled at the final hurdle. Something they're very good at and famous for is time trialling, but ultimately Pogacar just had a freak of a day. We know how good Dumoulin, Van Aert and Roglic are at time trialling, and for Pogacar to beat them all by, a minute and a half, it just shows how freakish his ride was on that day. But ultimately, it was a pretty good tour from them. They would be up there for team of the tour for me, to dominate the race like they did for so long. And Roglic didn't crack. He just got beaten by a better rider, which I think was good signs, although they didn't win the Grand Tour, which was their main aim. They had 4 blokes in the top 20. Roglic in second, a minute back on Pogacar. Tom Dumoulin in 7th, which I think is a pretty handy effort for a domestique. 7 minutes and 48 seconds back on Pogacar. Then you had Sepp Kuss in 15th. He was over 40 minutes back. And then Wout van Aert actually crept into the top 20. An hour and 20 back, but just shows how impressive he is to be finishing in the top 20 on GC and also winning sprints. He was 5th in the green jersey. Ended up quite a long way back, but that's obviously because he ended up having to sacrifice himself for Primoz. And Roglic was 3rd in the King of the Mountains jersey. Ultimately, the team came 2nd in the team's classification, 18 minutes behind the eventual winners, Movistar. And in terms of top 10s, they absolutely smashed it in this last week, to be honest. Stage 17, despite Miguel Angel Lopez stealing the show, they were probably the other big winners out of that stage. Roglic won a lot of time against his rivals. Sepp Kuss rode really well, almost burnt Roglic actually at one point. And then obviously on the time trial, they killed it with 3 of them coming in the top 5, Dumoulin, Van Aert and Roglic. And then on stage 18, Van Aert, Roglic and Dumoulin all came top 10. So pretty dominant week. They just got beaten by a better Slovenian on the day, or over the 3 weeks, I guess. And there's not really much they can be disappointed about. Like, I would almost go close to saying they had a 10 as well. I don't think there's anything they could have done better. I guess you could say if Roglic had anything left in his legs, he should have been more aggressive on the climbs to try and break Pogacar, because they kind of let Pogacar dictate the pace. But when you're in the yellow jersey and defending it, it's pretty rare that they attack. Like, even though Froome was so dominant, he only attacked a couple times on when he was like dominating the tours. But yeah, overall pretty good. I'll give them a 9 out of 10. Probably deserve a 10 out of 10, but ultimately they didn't get what they aimed for, which was the yellow jersey. So they'll get a 9, but ultimately great ride from Jumbo-Visma. Keen to see what they can do at the next 2 Grand Tours. Then 3rd on the podium, we had Richie Porte of Australia, my country obviously. Trek Segafredo is the team. He was 3 minutes and 30 seconds back, so he wasn't in the conversation for first, let's be real. But he rode really well. I did call that Rigoberto Urán would crack on the last podcast, but I said Miguel Angel Lopez would take his spot on the podium, which looked like a great call until the time trial, and Miguel Angel Lopez had a shocker. I was looking at Lopez versus Port head-to-head in time trials, and Lopez had beat him every time they'd ridden time trials against each other. So I actually tweeted the day of the time trial that Port was going to struggle, and that did not age very well at all, because Port came out and smashed it. And yeah, so he finished third. Congratulations to Port. He's been very unlucky in his Tour de France career, always coming in as like a top 5 favourite, and then always has a crash or a mechanical or something that ruins his tour. But he climbed really well. Didn't really attack on any of the climbs, but he was always there or thereabouts, similar to Roglic. Just probably got Roglic kind of just burnt him on a few of the final kicks on the climbing stages, and Port lost time in the crosswinds early on, like Pogacar did. The rest of his team, they didn't really do much, to be honest. Bauke Mollema, he crashed out on stage 13. He would have probably been a top 10, top 15 contender. Port ended up 8th in the King of the Mountains. That's kind of just part and parcel of being a GC contender. Nicholas Egg was 7th in the white jersey, but no real threat to the winner, obviously. They came 6th in the team classification, an hour and 40 back on Movistar, which is a pretty handy effort considering your second GC rider crashed out. If Mollema rode the whole tour, I'm sure they would have been top 3 or something for that classification. Overall for Trek Segafredo, great tour. I think if you told them they would walk away with a podium, I think they would have bitten your hand off. And they had a lot of stage success. I think they had the most top 10s in the first week, and they continued that run of form into the final 2 weeks. In terms of top 10s, Port came 3rd on stage 20. Mats Pedersen came 2nd on the final stage. Sturven came 3rd on stage 19. And Port had 2 top 10s on stage 17 and 18. So there was always a Trek Segafredo representative up there pretty much. And I'm going to give them a 9 out of 10. Actually, no, I'll go 8. They weren't as dominant as Jumbo-Visma, were they? But they achieved what they wanted to achieve. So very fair play to Trek Segafredo. Actually, I'll give them a 9 because Jumbo-Visma did not achieve their goal. So yeah. Next up, we've got Bahrain McLaren. The team of Mikel Landa. He came in 4th, 6 minutes back on Pogacar. So once again, not that close to 3rd. Port was kind of isolated in that position, a long way behind 2nd, a long way ahead of 4th. But their team rode pretty well across the 3 weeks. Landa, he came 4th, as I just mentioned. Caruso was also top 10, which he came 10th, which was pretty impressive, given the fact that he supposedly sacrificed himself a lot for Landa. I don't know if he did, to be honest. And then Pello Bilbao, he came 16th. He was just under an hour back on Pogacar. So pretty impressive for them to have 3 riders in the top 20. It always is for any team. They were 3rd in the team classification, just under an hour back of Movistar. In terms of top 10s in the last week, they didn't really have any notable results. Caruso and Landa were just up there in the mountains, and then Caruso did 7th in the TT, which is a pretty good effort. But yeah, ultimately a pretty good tour for Bahrain McLaren. They seemed to get stronger as the tour went on. I don't remember exactly what stage it was. It might have been stage 18? No, I'm not sure. There was a stage where Landa attacked the leaders group, met up with one of his teammates, then kicked on to another teammate, and it looked like a move that could have worked, but the peloton weren't letting him get too far away. But yeah, it almost seems like Mikel Landa would rather a 5-week tour because he always gets pretty good in the last week. But ultimately, good success for Bahrain McLaren. If you told them they'd have a 4th and another top 10, I think they would have taken that for sure. So I'll give them an 8 out of 10. Next up, we've got Movistar. Movistar, they kind of came in with a few GC contenders. They had Enric Mas, Alejandro Valverde, Marc Soler. But ultimately, it was Enric Mas who really stood out. He was 5th on GC, 6 minutes back on Pogacar. Then they had Alejandro Valverde just finished outside the top 10, 12th. He was 17 minutes back on Pogacar. And Carlos Verona, the mountain specialist, he snuck into the top 20, an hour and 20 minutes behind on Pogacar. Mas also came 2nd in the white jersey, 6 minutes behind Pogacar. But yeah, ultimately really impressive from Mass. Valverde, obviously, he keeps defying the laws of age, so I guess that's impressive in its own self. But yeah, Mass really impressive. Kind of always thought Marc Soler was the better of the two, but Enric Mas showed that he has Grand Tour winning ability, and he was very impressive in that last week. Always seemed to be, he was kind of on Port's level for most of that last week, and Landers level. Those three were kind of in a group of their own for most of it, just chilling with Roglic. Didn't quite have the attacking ability that Lopez showed on stage 17, but yeah, Enric Mas really impressive. And it wouldn't shock me. I wonder what Grand Tour he's riding out of the Vuelta and the Giro, because I think he could be a contender for whichever one he chooses there. Mass, in terms of top 10s, Mass had 3 top 10s, stage 17, 18 and 20. And they also won their team classification, 5th time in 6 years, I believe. So that'll keep the sporting directors and the CEOs happy, because they love to target that team classification. Next up, we've got Astana. Their GC leader, Miguel Angel Lopez, came 6th, 6 minutes and 7 seconds back on Pogacar. Oh, I didn't give him Movistar rating, sorry. I'll give Movistar... I'll give them an 8 out of 10, because they probably would have expected a top 10, and that's what they got. 5th, probably a bit better than they were expecting, but yeah, ultimately pretty good. Astana... It's a tough one with them. They started off very poorly. Lopez didn't really find his form till late in the tour. And then sadly, he cracked on the time trial. Not to pigeonhole like a whole nation of cyclists, but the Colombians, because they're small, they're light, they often are they're often very variable in their time trial results, some better than others, obviously. But yeah, Angel Lopez, he was on the podium coming into the time trial. He walked out of that time trial in 6th. Pretty disastrous day for the team. And it really sucked, because he was one of the best climbers in the tour, so you wanted to see him reap the rewards for his efforts, but he let himself down a bit, coming in 6th. Ultimately, his first Tour de France, he's still only young. I think they would have taken 6th if you offered to them at the start of the race, but in the way it came to them, the fact that he was on the podium and then slipped up in a pretty major way as well, he gave up 3 spots. I'm going to have to give them a 6 out of 10. Probably a bit harsh, but I think the mood in the camp right now would be pretty deflated. But that stage 17 win by Miguel Angel Lopez was so good to watch. He just burnt Pogacar and Roglic, who had been the best climbers of the tour at that point, and just showed how good he is in that high altitude, high mountainous stage environment. So that got him in 5th in the King of the Mountains jersey. Other things for Astana, Harold Tejada came 6th in the white jersey, over 2 hours back though on Pogacar, but he was not bad in the mountains. And yeah, they came 7th in the team classification. They had a stage win with Alexei Lusenko on stage 6, but yeah, ultimately just a decent tour by Astana, nothing special. Next up, we've got EF Pro Cycling. Another one who, if you told them they were going to get one top 10, they'd probably cop it going into it. But if you told them they were going to be sitting in 3rd till about stage 15 and then they would drop down to 8th, they would probably be a bit disappointed. Obviously, I won't lie, I'm probably going to have to rate them low. The situations are unfortunate. Higuita crashed out on stage 15. Danny Martinez crashed on one of the early stages, and he was in great form coming into it off the back of a win at the Dauphiné. So it kind of just left them with Rigoberto with GC hosts, and he ended up coming 8th, 8 minutes behind Pogacar. As I mentioned, he really did crack on one of the, I think it was stage 17. It might have been stages beforehand. But yeah, he just showed, I think he's kind of shown this in a few tours, to be honest. He's really good in a 2 weeks race, and then 3 weeks seems to be a little bit too much for him. And he often can crack on a big time mountain stage and lose a lot of time to the other guys. But yeah, Danny Martinez, he's still only young, so, and he, crashes. I'm sure a lot of it's the cyclist's fault, but it's always unfortunate. He came fourth in the white jersey. He also had a stage win on stage 13, which was probably the highlight of EF Pro Cycling's tour. Nelson Powless as well. He was really impressive in the mountain stages. He was ninth on the white jersey. As a team, they came fourth. That's probably something they could have finished a bit higher with if Higuita stayed in the race, because they could have had 3 high finishes in the mountain stages, which would have earned them a lot of time against their rivals. But yeah, ultimately, bit of a hit and miss tour for EF Pro Cycling. If 5's average, which I believe it should be in a scale of 10 because it is half, not 7. Come on, fellas. If 5's average, I'll give them 5 because it's probably, if you told them like their bare minimum expectation probably would have been a top 10, and that's what they got. So that's probably just an average performance. They had a bit of bad luck, but you kind of make your own luck, don't you? Next up, we've got Mitchelton Scott. This is a tough one to rate because they kind of came into it not expecting to ride GC, ended up holding the yellow jersey for 3 days, I think it was, maybe 4, and ended up riding for GC. So their expectations aren't really comparable to their end result, but ultimately they had Adam Yates in 9th, 9 minutes and 25 back on Pogacar. Similar to Uran, he looked really good till about day 14, 15, and then he started to show that he doesn't have the legs of some of the elite GC riders. But yeah, they held the yellow jersey for 3 days. Given the fact that they weren't coming in with high expectations, they maybe just wanted a couple close stage performances from Yates and Chavez. I think they did pretty well. And Luka Mezek, I think he had his best tour, Grand Tour ever. He had 5 top 10 performances, including 2 seconds. So sadly didn't get the stage win, but he did really well. So I'll give them a 7, or maybe an 8 out of 10 because Mitchelton Scott, they don't have the biggest budget, so there's pretty good effort from them to have 5 top 10s from their sprinter, 2 seconds from him, and then to hold the yellow jersey for 3 days and have a top 10 GC rider when you weren't trying to go GC. That's a pretty good effort. Next up, Cofidis. They had Guillaume Martin. He came 11th. And look, Martin was probably the most impressive rider in the first week, out of the GC favourites. But ultimately, he looked good in the last week, but that middle week really just proved to be a lot for him. He kind of continuously got dropped on the steep climbs, and he wouldn't lose too much time because he wouldn't just explode. He would kind of just set his own rhythm and then slowly get back or just go at his own pace. Which ultimately kept him in an 11th, but he was 17 minutes back on the leaders after being 28 seconds after the first 10 stages. So he did lose a lot of time, but ultimately it was pretty good signs from him. He's not too old. He's not eligible for the white jersey, but I don't think he's too much older than that. So he must be 26 or 27, and there's a bright future for him. I have to be honest, he probably will have more expectation put on him in future tours, given Pinot and Bardet's not failures, but they're always the one with the pressure, and Bardet's had a podium, but ultimately neither of them have won the tour, and they're probably past their prime, so now it's probably going to shift to Martin a bit along with Alaphilippe. So we'll see how he deals with that, because we know the French media is very full on. But yeah, bit of a quiet third week from Cofidis. Viviani had a 5th on the final stage, which was a good effort from him because he wasn't in the greatest of form. He had 2 top 10s, but wasn't really looking at winning any stages like he normally does. And yeah, Cofidis, I don't think anyone was expecting Martin to be a top 3 contender for over half the race. So I'll give them a 7 out of 10. They probably would have been expecting a little bit more from Viviani, but I think Martin exceeded expectation. And they'll take an 11th, I reckon, with him. Next up, we've got Ineos Grenadiers, formerly Team Sky, famous history with the race in the last decade. But sadly, their leader, the defending champ, Egan Bernal, he cracked on one of, I don't remember what stage it was, to be honest. It was before the last rest day, so it must have been something like stage 12 or 13. But it just seemed a little bit too much for him this year. He kind of came a little bit undercooked, you'd say. And yeah, that proved in the last week. He just continuously kept getting dropped from the lead packs, and ultimately he abandoned the race on stage 16. And Jonathan Crasher Viejo also abandoned on 18. So they ended up only with 6 men, but that didn't stop them from having their highlight of the tour on stage 18. Mikhail Kwiatkowski winning, Carapaz in behind him. It was a pretty beautiful stage, to be honest, not to get too soppy on you now, but they rode in arm in arm, and then Carapaz let Kwiatkowski go, because Carapaz was obviously going for the polka dots. If Carapaz came away with the polka dots, Kwiatkowski got that stage win, that maybe have saved their tour a little bit. But if 5's average, look, they've got such lofty expectations. I think I'm going to give them a below average score. I'm probably going to give them a 3 out of 10. It must be the first time they haven't had a top 10 GC rider since, 2011. Or I don't even know when Team Sky was founded, to be honest, with Carapaz in at 13th. I do think if Carapaz rode for himself the whole tour, he would have done better than 13th, so we can't really judge him off that, but that's ultimately where he finished, and he came second in the polka dots, so he had quite an awesome second half of the tour after starting slow. But yeah, it was a bit of a disappointment with Bernal crashing out, well, not crashing out, but quitting after some pain when he was getting dropped. Sivakov also had a bit of a shocking tour. Lots of crashes, lost a lot of time, and he was someone who I was interested in seeing how he went coming into it, but that's a shame we didn't really get to see him in full stride. They did come 5th overall, though, in the GC, which isn't team's classification, which isn't too shabby. Next up, we've got Arceus Samsic, the team of Nairo Quintana, and once again, I've said this about Yates, I've said it about Uran. 3 weeks just seems to be too much for Quintana. I love him so much. He's probably my favourite rider of the last decade, but he just really struggles to put in 3 weeks of consistent riding. And on one day, he can be right up there with the best GC climbers and even pushing them. And then the next day, he'll rock up and he'll lose 10 minutes on those guys. So he came 17th, an hour behind Pogacar. So he didn't just lose little time like Guillaume Martin. He lost big time in that last week. And yeah, just really hurt to see him get dropped so early on pretty much every climb. Warren Barguil actually finished higher than him in GC, came 14th. And it would have been interesting to see how Barguil went if Quintana wasn't there, to be honest. Barguil kind of looked in better form than Quintana, if I'm completely honest with you. I think he could have had a top 10, but he finished 14th, but he sacrificed a lot for Nairo. Barguil had a 6th on stage 16, but yeah, probably wasn't the greatest tour. They sacrificed so much just for Quintana, and ultimately he cracked once again. And yeah, they didn't have much stage success because of that. They didn't really go for any other jerseys, so I'm probably going to have to give them a below par score, and I'll give them a 4 out of 10. They aren't the biggest team, but when you're putting in so much for Nairo Quintana, you probably want a bit more than a 17th back, don't you? Because you've kind of jeopardised the rest of your tour for him. Next up, we've got B&B Hotels Vital Concept. Their main guy on GC was Pierre Rolland. He came 18th, an hour and 8 minutes behind Pogacar. Brian Coquard finished 4th on the green jersey on 181 points. Pierre Rolland also finished 7th on the King of the Mountains classification. I think I did predict him to win that, to be honest. He had a crack at it, but he didn't get too close in the end, if I'm completely honest. They finished 16th as a team. They were a bit more quiet in the mountains, to be honest. Coquard was kind of their guy on the flat stages, and apart from Rollon and Pacher, they didn't offer too much in the mountains. They had 2 nights on the final week. It's a tough one because they probably would have been praying for a stage win with Coquard. He had so many top 10s. I think he had 8 top 10 performances. Yet they didn't really get too close to a win. The best he did was 3rd. They actually got closer to a win with Pierre Rolland, who came 2nd on stage 12. It's a tough one. I'll just give them bang average, 5th. I think this is probably what they're expecting. A lot of near misses from Coquard. If he had a stage win or even a 2nd, probably would have pushed them above average, but the fact that he just had a lot of near misses, probably what they were expecting. And Roland, although he was pretty good in the mountains, nothing crazy. So I'll give them bang on average 5. We're rolling through the French teams now. Next up, we've got Groupama FDJ. Obviously, famously, Thibaut Pinot's team had a bit of a shocking tour, didn't he? Ultimately, their top GC man was Sebastian Reichenbach, who actually rode really well in the last week after Pinot had basically given up on GC. He had a 3rd on stage 16, 8th on stage 12, and he looked very impressive in the mountains. But yeah, ultimately, not too much going for this team, to be honest. Valentin Madouas came 3rd in the white jersey, but he was over an hour and 30 minutes behind Pogacar. They're 11th in the team classification. And because they had such high hopes for Thibaut Pinot, I'm going to be brutally honest here. I'm going to give them a 2. They had a bit of a stinker of a tour, really. They threw, similar to Arceus Samsic, they threw everything in it for Thibaut Pinot, and that jeopardised their ability to do anything else in the tour. So yeah, it wasn't really a great tour in the end for them. I feel bad for Thibaut Pinot. But yeah, they've got to do better, if I'm completely honest. Next year will be interesting to see what they do, or even the Grand Tours coming up this year. You'd think Arnaud Démare gets a crack at one of the Grand Tours, and we'll see if they have more success on the flat stages, because they might come back to the next year's tour preferring the flats over the mountains, because although Pinot's had some memorable tours, they haven't had that success that they've been vying for in the last 5-6 years. Next up, similarly, we've got another French team, Argy Desert La Mondiale, the team of Romain Bardet, who crashed out on stage 13. Similarly, I keep saying it, but not much really happened for them this tour, because they claimed they weren't going for GC, but Bardet was kind of always going for GC, to be honest. They had Mikel Schellerel 26th, an hour and 40 behind Pogacar. They had the King of the Mountain right through to stage 17, I think it was. And then Benoit Cosnefroy coughed it up after holding it for like 2 weeks. So I guess that's a bit of a highlight, but a shame he didn't come away with it. He rode really well. Nons Peters had his win on stage 8, which was a highlight of their tour. Oliver Narsson had quite a few top 10s, but nothing outrageous. They were 8th in the team classification. So, look, if they weren't riding for GC, you can't really question them for not doing well in GC. But ultimately, I think they would have been hoping for a Romain Bardet top 10, even if they weren't out and out going for the yellow jersey. So I'm going to give them a 4. They did have the King of the Mountains jersey for a long time, a stage win, so not the worst tour, but yeah, sadly, Bardet crashing out nuked their chances of having a decent GC finish. So, I'll give them a 4, but it's probably a bit harsh, if I'm honest. Next up, we've got Total Direct Energy. Look, I'll be honest, this team did absolutely nothing. It sounds very harsh, but can't really argue with the stats. They were 21st in the team classification. They only had 2 top 10s for the whole race. Roman Sicard was 31st on GC, 2 hours and 10 minutes behind Pogacar. No one else in the top 10 of any other classification. So, look, they probably didn't have the highest expectations going in it. They weren't really riding for any jersey. They were probably just going for breakaways and TV time. Lilian Calmejane crashed out stage 8. He was probably their most famous rider, highly rated rider. But yeah, look, without being too negative, I'll probably just have to give them a 4. I don't think they had great expectations, so it's probably not too below average for the team, but they didn't really cause much carnage or do anything like that, so pretty boring tour for them. Next up, we've got Bora Hansgrohe. They had opposite to Total Direct Energy. Bora Hansgrohe had a crazy tour. They were at the front of it, pretty much every breakaway. They were there for every intermediate sprint, every sprint finish. They were in it in all senses of the word, all senses of the phrase. They were going for pretty much every jersey at once, which might have come back and hurt them. But at the end of the race, they had Leonard Kamna 33rd on GC, Peter Sagan sadly second on green jersey. Lost out to the man we'll talk to next, but his streak his streak ends. I don't think he's ever been beaten in the Tour de France in the points classification. The year Michael Matthews won it, I think he crashed out early in the race. And yeah, that's sad. I think he's won 7 or 8. True legend of the sport. I'd put him up there with the GOAT. So with the GOAT, obviously I didn't see like Eddie Merckx and Bernard Hinault and stuff like that. But yeah, Peter Sagan is an absolute star. Just to show how good he was, I was doing my top 10 athletes of the 21st century before, or the 2010s decade, sorry, and I was legitimately considering putting Peter Sagan in there because he was just so awesome over that last decade, but sadly it looks like he's lost his turn of pace, to be honest. He's still a freak to come second in the Tour de France in the points classification with being out of form, and I quote that. Pretty impressive. But yeah, ultimately he was just beaten by the better man. Leonard Kamner also came 10th on the King of the Mountains and 5th in the white jersey. The reason he was so high in all those standings, he came first on stage 16. But yeah, I'm going to rate them pretty highly, to be honest. They didn't really achieve what they probably wanted, which was first on the green jersey, and probably a little bit higher with Matty Bookman in the GC, but he came in with 3 days' notice, so he probably, inside the team, they probably didn't have too much expectation of him personally. But yeah, I'm going to have to give them I'll give them a 6 out of 10 because they didn't win the green jersey. They didn't have a high-performing GC guy, but they caused a lot of carnage. They had a stage win and a lot of top 3s in stages, so I think they had a pretty good tour. Next up, we've got De Koning Quickstep. They won the green jersey, but this team probably had a quieter race than normal. Usually they're causing a lot of havoc, but Alaphilippe wasn't at his best. He was trying, but he just wasn't in top form. He was their top GC guy, 36th, over 2 hours behind Pogacar. But the man for De Koning Quickstep, who turned this tour from a failure to a success, Sam Bennett, 380 points. He beat Sagan by almost 100 points in the end, so he actually did it quite comfortably. And he won the Queen stage at Champs-Élysées. I think they low-key call it the Queen stage that decides GC, but he won the Premier stage on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. It's a dream of every sprinter in the world, and he added that to his stage win on stage 10, so great tour for Sam Bennett. First person to ever beat Peter Sagan in the points classification on the Tour de France. And yeah, he just looked better than Peter Sagan in pretty much every aspect of the tour, maybe barring climbing, but they were pretty similar there, to be honest. But I don't think Bennett lost to Sagan on too many of the sprints. Just looked faster than him every day of the tour. But yeah, to any team who comes away with the jersey, they've had a pretty good tour. So I'll give them a 8 out of 10, just because they might have hoped a little bit more would have come out of Julian Alaphilippe and some of the other riders, but in terms of the mountains and the GC, they weren't going to win GC obviously, but maybe a little bit of a high performance in 36th, but they successfully won the green jersey against Peter Sagan, and that's enough for an 8 out of 10 and 2 stage wins. Probably a bit harsh, but they have pretty lofty expectations of the team. Next up, we've got Israel Startup Nation, new riders to the team, to the tour. I believe this was their first appearance. Their top GC man was Dan Martin, 41st, 2.5 hours behind Pogacar. And then they didn't really have anything else going in any other jerseys, but quick shout out to Hugo Hofstetter. Don't know much about him, but he had 5 top 10s on the flat stages, including an 8th at the Champs-Élysées, and he was probably one of the stars of the tour for me. I can't lie, I didn't notice him much. He was kind of just in the bunch of every sprint, but he always just somehow snuck into that top 10, and I've never heard of him. Don't know much about him, but that's very impressive. 5 top 10s from a guy who I'm saying I don't know who he is, so fair play to him. But ultimately, pretty mythical tour from Israel Startup Nation. They didn't have much expectation going into it. However, they did have 7 top 10s, which isn't bad for a mythical team. I'll give them a 5, just because it's probably exactly what they were expecting. Next, we've got CCC, probably one of the quieter tours I've witnessed of this team, who were formerly BMC. They're usually pretty good, but they were pretty irrelevant this tour. Top on GC, they had Simon Geschke in 48th, over 2.5 hours behind Pogacar. I guess their most valued asset was Matteo Trentin this tour, third on the points classification, but he was fairly comfortably behind Peter Sagan, almost 100 points behind him, almost 200 points behind Bennett. So he had a crack, but ultimately, oh no, he wasn't that far back, sorry. It was 20 points back on Sagan. I'm dogging him a bit there. So not a bad effort, to be honest. Almost beat Sagan, but he was 120 points behind Bennett, and they didn't get that stage win they were looking for. So I'll give them a 4, just because they probably would have liked to cause a little bit more carnage on stages than they did. Zakarin crashing out probably hurt them on stage 12. He would have been looking to attack in the high mountains, but yeah. 3 teams left. We've got Lotto Soudal. They had 3 guys crash out very early on in the race, so they were down to 5 for most of it. But the star of the show for them was Caleb Ewan, probably in the top 10 riders of the race. Their main man was Thomas de Gent. He came 52nd in the GC, but yeah, Caleb Ewan 6th on the green jersey. However, he did have 2 stage wins, 2nd, 7th, and an 8th. So for someone who hardly had a lead-out train because they only had 4 other riders, pretty good effort. So I'm going to give them a 6. They probably would have been expecting Ewan to win a stage, if I'm completely honest, going into it. But for them to do it in such fighting circumstances, I think they would be pretty happy with how they did in the end. Next up, we've got Subweb. And for me, these guys probably win Team of the Tour. They didn't have anyone up there for GC. Their highest guy was Mark Hirschi in 54th, over almost 3 hours behind Pogacar. But they caused absolute carnage on every stage. Like I said about Bora Hansgrohe, they were just in there every day. They had people in the break, people in the bunch sprints, people on the mountains. They just caused chaos. You couldn't go watch this tour without noticing Sunweb a lot. They had a lot of stage wins, to be honest. Mark Hirschi had 1, Søren Kragh Andersen had 2, and then they also had a couple podiums with Hirschi having a 2nd, Case Bowl having 2 podiums. Hirschi had another 3rd, so they just really impressed all the way through the race. And I'm going to give them a 9 out of 10. I'll be honest, I didn't really have any expectations going into it for this Sunweb team. Didn't know much about Case Bowl as a sprinter. The only bike I really knew about was Nicholas Royer and Tadej Benoot. But yeah, Mark Hirschi really stepped up. Søren Kragh Andersen had the race of his life. Hirschi is a young rider. He was 8th in the white jersey, 4th in the King of the Mountains. He's one to look out for the future. I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up being a GC rider with his climbing prowess and all-round abilities. But yeah, absolute star tour from Sunweb. Well done to the team directors. They seem to be very smart tactically as well. And yeah, probably next to Jumbo-Visma, they were probably team of the tour. But given their limited resources compared to Jumbo-Visma and, they didn't have the big names or the big expectations, I'll probably give team of the tour to Sunweb. And Mark Hirschi is probably right up there for rider of the tour and Søren Kragh Andersen next to, your Wout van Aert, your Tadej Pogacars. So well done to them. Finally, we've got NTT Pro Cycling. Michael Valgren came 73rd. Look, I'll be honest, no offense to this team, they're pretty mythical. They did absolutely nothing all 3 weeks. Their main hope, Giacomo Nizzolo, crashed out on stage 8 after having 2 top 10 finishes in the first 3 stages. So yeah, after he crashed out, they didn't really have much hope. Bosenhagen copped a 2nd, and then Gibbons and Volscheid had 2 10ths, but they weren't really relevant, to be honest. Like Total Direct Energy, I didn't really notice them at all. And it's probably the quietest tour this team has had since its introduction to the Tour de France. They're normally quite active for such a small team. But yeah, a little bit disappointing. Pozzovivo crashed out as well, so who knows, he might have done stuff in the mountains. But yeah, that's it for the teams. Ultimately, it was just a cracking tour. I'm really looking forward to the upcoming cycling events. I know we've got the World Champs. It might even be this weekend. I don't know when it is, to be honest. I don't know the schedule exactly, but I think it's something like the World Champs, and we've got 3 weeks of classics, including like Paris-Roubaix and Liège-Bastogne-Liège, and then we've got both Grand Tours. I think there's an overlap of like a week, so it's going to be absolute chaos. Hopefully SBS Cyclings turns it on for us and might come to you with more cycling content because I'm loving it at the moment. But yeah, great tour. Really enjoyed these 3 cycling episodes, but stay tuned to the potty. If you're still listening, congratulations for getting here. I really appreciate it. If you would like, feel free to subscribe and like to the YouTube channel and the YouTube video. Rate and review us on the listening platforms. And stay tuned. There's going to be AFL and NRL content coming out soon. A bit of NFL, a bit of French Open. So yeah, plenty more content coming your way. But thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your week. Peace.